All right, so we're back at the Cracks in Postmodernity. Today we have Ross Barkan, who is the writer of the new novel Glass Century. He's also a columnist for New York Magazine. Ross, thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Very excited to be here.
So I want to focus on your novel, which came out last week, Glass Century. You gave me a review copy pretty early on, and honestly, it was a total page turner. I mean, I mentioned in my review in Compact Magazine that the suspense was really awesome, but also just the way that you covered a lot of the issues that you write about in your more politically focused nonfiction writing. A lot about the life of New York and Bay Ridge, post 9/11 life. So start out just by telling us what inspired you to write this? Like, how did you actually decide you were going to write this particular novel?
Yeah, it's really good question. So, I was talking with my girlfriend at the time about it, actually, and she, this was around 2019. This was the fall of 2019, and we were thinking about what I would write next. I had written a novel that would be published in 2022 about a cult in upstate New York called The Night Burns Bright, and I was really thinking through what I wanted to do next. And she suggested, Vanessa, she said, well, you have an interesting background, and why not write about family? And I thought it was a really interesting prompt, because I didn't want to write memoir at all. I write novels. I do nonfiction, not memoir. But I hadn't done a novel that really grappled with elements of my life and also the world my parents came from. So my parents, grew up in New York City. They were older when they had me, so they, came of age in the 1950s and 60s and 70s in New York City. So I've always been very interested in that world. And I myself, born and raised in New York City, grew up in Brooklyn. I had elements of that in my earlier books, but I really wanted to explore it on a grander scale. And I didn't know exactly what that would be. But I knew in the fall of 2019, I wanted to tackle a bigger story about a family. I wanted something that had the range of the novels I enjoyed the most. I wanted to be ambitious and also polyphonic in some fashion. And I didn't want to have it limited to one perspective. Though at the same time, I knew there'd have to be characters I stuck with. There'd be a few big characters. And immediately Mona, the main protagonist, she came to me. And I knew she would be this real engine of the book, but really, it was thinking a lot about family, but both my own and family in general too, since and how families move through time, and also how events act upon people, the intimacy paired with the grandeur of history. I was interested in both. Like, I wanted to have a novel on that really personal level, but at the same time dealt with great events, so like 9/11 and the fiscal crisis and the pandemic, where it ends. Actually, when I started the book, the pandemic hadn't happened yet, and I was writing it, and I finished it in August of 20, so by then I knew it would have to be incorporated in some form. And actually the novel ends there because that's where history ran up to. I'm glad I did that. I think it bookends very well. And it would have been a stranger novel if I was incorporating kind of, post-pandemic New York. I almost think that's another book, and that's actually something I'm tinkering with now. But those are some of the things I was thinking about as I was getting going with it.
Yeah, so obviously the 9/11 theme stands out. It's something that other novelists have addressed. I mean, Ottessa Moshfegh in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, among others. But, I mean, I've written before about how I have this kind of strange, perverse fascination with 9/11. I mean, I was alive for it. I saw it all the way from New Jersey on top of a hilltop.
Yeah.
You were here, right?
Yes,
You
I
were
was.
in
Yes,
Brooklyn.
I was in Brooklyn. I was 11, going on 12. I would turn 12 a month later. So I was very much here for it, seeing it unfold. I was in school. I saw, both the towers collapse on TV and then the smoke cloud hanging over New York City,
Yeah.
for a very long time. It's a long black cloud of smoke trailing in the sky. And then, of course, Ground Zero smoldered for a very long time, which people don't realize. And my parents, the autobiographical elements of the book are, my mom worked very close to the World Trade Center. She's not a photojournalist. She worked for the federal government at Department of Housing and Urban Development. And her office was very close to it. My father also worked for the federal government, and he worked in one of the smaller buildings in the World Trade Center complex, and his office was destroyed. He was not in the Twin Towers itself, but he was in that complex. And actually, what is also true, and I fictionalize it, but it's pulled from truth, is my father did almost die because he had a breakfast meeting scheduled up on the Twin Towers that he canceled for a doctor's appointment. My mom actually got him to cancel. So that was drawn on reality, which is something that, haunted me for a long time, which is he very easily could have died at his breakfast meeting, and he chose instead not to go. So that was always, I knew this was something I wanted to write about. I wanted to tackle this. It was very personal to be September 11th, as it is for a lot of people. And in terms of like the 9/11 novel, and this is something we've talked a bit about and your review gets at, I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but the 9/11 novels that have been published aren't great. I offer myself as a rejoinder to them because I find that they don't get at the day as viscerally as they can. I think one mistake a lot of them make is treating 9/11 as a tack-on. Like Moshfegh does it. Yeah. The book ends that way. Paul Auster does it in the Brooklyn Follies in a really gimmicky way. DeLillo isn't a tack-on, but Falling Man is not one of his stronger books. So it's hard to write it. 9/11 novels are tough. I do think I benefited from some perspective of being further removed. I was starting my book in 2019. I think the 2000s books struggle with their proximity to the day.
Yeah, no, because in addition to like being alive during 9/11, witnessing it from afar, I as a kid, I was 9 years old when it happened. I would watch the news coverage of it constantly, the repeating, the repetitive showing of the videos, the footage, and then everything with the wars afterwards. So I don't know. As a kid, I was transfixed on this image, and I couldn't really explain why. And then as time went on, I heard Stockhausen's quote about how 9/11 is the greatest piece of performance art ever. And okay, obviously it's a scandalous thing to say, but it made me start to think, okay, well, does this shed light on why I have this morbid obsession with watching the footage? And I started to really sit and think about that. And I ended up writing this, it was, kind of playful piece for Countier, juxtaposing. So there's this meme of a camera pans up for a Subway ad, and it's Mariah Carey's Glitter, the biopic that flopped, and then it pans up towards the tower collapsing. I was like, okay, this is interesting because you have this pop star who is very decadent and whose career is falling apart, has a mental breakdown, and then you have the collapse of the towers. This is, in a way, they're both emblematic of the collapse of the neoliberal capitalist kind of hegemony. And this goes to the theme of glass in the novel, that there's this glass is alluring, it's shiny, it draws you in, and yet it can shatter just like that. And then I eventually read Baudrillard's. I think it was a series of lectures that Verso turned into a book. But it's a very typical Baudrillardian take on 9/11 about, again, capitalism and neoliberal consensus, blah blah blah. And what I loved about the novel is that you kind of, because you're painting such a broad picture about the history of New York and of the country in general, the Giuliani era, wanting to clean everything up, sanitizing these neighborhoods that are overrun with crime and violence, poverty. there's something exciting about it, and yet you feel like all of it could just fall apart just like that. So I don't know, say more about how you tried to capture everything that led up to 9/11 and just convey that all in the plot of the story.
Yeah, I mean, the Twin Towers, I was fascinated with the Twin Towers from childhood. You know, I went up there as a kid. I was at the observation deck. I went to Windows on the World, the restaurant that's at the top of it. I used to draw pictures of the Twin Towers as a child. I was very enraptured by them. And I was, of the generation, as we both are, where the Twin Towers had really joined the New York psyche and become a real part of the city in a way they were not when they were built. And that was something that's very interesting to me learning about, since I wasn't alive then. When they were constructed, they were viewed as intrusions. They were viewed as quite ugly. They were scorned. They had wiped out a neighborhood in Lower Manhattan. They were these brutalist, futuristic, monoliths in the sky. So I have a little section about that, kind of how it was viewed initially, and then how over time they became very much a part of New York. And I was thinking a lot about that. The time of 9/11, the Twin Towers are at almost their cultural peak, in terms of where, if you look at 1990s television, they're everywhere. Sex and the City, The Simpsons, and so on. And I was thinking a lot about that. And it's funny, it's still, even with the pandemic and everything else, it's still the day I've been the most scared. I don't know if I'll ever be more scared than on that day. And it was such a spectacle. I mean, it was so hyper real. I mean, it really felt that day. I remember thinking as an 11-year-old, this is a movie. This is not real life. It was the first time I ever thought that way. It felt like the end of childhood. It felt like the start of something else. I've said before, I think that the 21st century starts on that day. That's where we begin. The 20th century extends, in my view, psychically into 2001, and on September 11th, we are definitively in a new century. And I remember having that feeling at 11. Not that the 21st century begins on that day. I wasn't thinking that, but I was thinking this is new. This is a new world has opened up. A dark world has opened up. Life will not be the same, and I understood that even then. And I wanted in fiction to get at that in some way, and I knew through a family, right, and also describing the day itself, and I took special care to write about it from the perspective of one of the main characters, Mona, who's watching it unfold in Lower Manhattan. She's a photographer, and she's out taking photos, and she's with a stringer getting quotes, because it was the day of the mayoral race, is the primary that day, so she's out doing that. And I wanted to capture the confusion, because people don't realize, it was two planes, two towers, which meant no one thought the first tower was a terrorist attack. I mean, very few people. You'd have to be pretty paranoid to have seen a plane hit one tower and think, we're under attack, it's Al-Qaeda or some terrorist organization trying to take us out. It's the second plane hitting the second tower. That's where the new world begins. That's where you have the thought, this is war. And I remember that feeling, that sensation, and talking to people, talking to my mom, who fled at that moment. She was one of the last people over the bridge into Brooklyn when she saw the second plane hit. And I wanted to write about that, to get at that. Like I said, this is a work of fiction, but I incorporate stories that happen. I exaggerate, I change them. That's the beauty of fiction. But there's a core element of, my parents were very close to 9/11. I was very close to 9/11, and that was a big part of our lives.
I mean, that being said, that it touched your life so personally, I mean, like, what do you make of these Zoomers and their 9/11 memes that they've been making the last year or so?
I'm very fascinated by it all. I mean, I've talked to Zoomers, not about the memes, but I've found myself, as now I'm in my 30s, and so you when you're growing up, right, you're not socializing with people who don't remember 9/11, but now you are, right? I mean, that's the nature of aging. It's very interesting. I think about this a lot as a 35-year-old now. I obviously will, mingle with people who are like 27 or 28, or even 29, and they don't remember it. They're too young, and I that's the cycle of life. I mean, that's just how it is. But also, it is a dividing line. I mean, it's very easy generational dividing line. You are a millennial if you remember September 11th, and you are not if you don't. I mean, it's as simple as that. I think there's all these, when does the millennial and Z begin and end? To me, it's very cut and dry. Do you have a memory of September 11th? Does it mean something? Can you work off a literal memory of it? You're a millennial, and if you can't, you're not. And I think the memes come because, in some ways, you're trying to understand it. I mean, I don't view it in a hostile way. I'm not offended by it. I think at heart, you can't comprehend it if you weren't there or you weren't experiencing it even from afar. And you don't have to be in New York to remember 9/11. You could have been in Ohio. Everyone in New York, everyone in the world, has a 9/11 story. I mean, it's like you had a Kennedy assassination story if you are not in Dallas. Everyone could say, "Where was I when Kennedy was shot?" If you were alive then, or Martin Luther King, right? And so, to me, the memes, it's probably some, at heart, putting aside, the cynicism or the irony, it's some attempt to understand. Because you can't really understand it in the same way if you weren't there. It's just, I truly can't comprehend what Pearl Harbor meant that day, what the Kennedy assassination meant that day, what, you take it back further, the outbreak of the Civil War. We can't truly, we can read historical accounts, we can come close, but we're always at a remove. Whereas, I think the now, Zoomer, who was a baby or not alive for 9/11, many of them were not even alive, right? This is, you fundamentally feel you must understand it in some way, and maybe you miss something important, right? You miss this, just as we missed out on major 20th century events not being around for them. 9/11, we've had a lot of major surreal turns in the 21st century, from the election of Trump to COVID, but 9/11 still, for the single day, those single acts, right? The spectacle of it is unmatched. I mean, no element of pop culture anticipated September 11th. I mean, that's something I always think about. Every disaster movie, every way New York was destroyed on film, all the books, right? None of them imagined airplanes into the Twin Towers, and that at its heart is, that says everything. Yeah. We couldn't dream it. It had to happen.
Yeah, and one of the characters says that it feels like it's a fantasy, that it's not even real.
But, it's this sort of thing where you couldn't will it into being. I mean, it's there's no novel for it. There's no film for it. There's no TV show for it. Independence Day, it's a laser beam from the sky blowing up the Empire State Building. Or if you look at any sort of disaster film or post-apocalyptic film, they're imagining that the Twin Towers still exist, or they're just the idea you're taking an airplane, two airplanes, and hitting the towers and knocking them down. I mean, it's that is the hyper real. That is beyond human imagination, and that's the struggle with, I think, fiction in the wake of 9/11. That probably explains some of the struggle of fiction. Probably why you needed some more perspective.
But in a way, the meme is an attempt to capture the hyper real.
I think so. Yeah. No, I think it is. Yeah. I think it is. That's why I get. So I don't condemn it. I don't. Yeah. I don't. I mean, you're trying in some way to do something with it. Because what else are you going to do with it? Yeah.
So, all right, I want to focus now. I mean, you picked various neighborhoods throughout the city. And, you know, I've mentioned before, and I cited in my review, you know, like you've written on your Substack about like the deep boroughs versus like the gentrifying parts of Brooklyn and Queens, etc., that are coming to look more like, you know, the upper class parts of Manhattan. And, you know, this sense of the uprooting, you know, like there's this loss of, I don't know, the people who have been here for generations, who have local businesses that are, you know, has a strong ethnic flavor, whatever. And, you know, obviously Bay Ridge is a big part of the story. A lot of it takes place in Bay Ridge. And I should mention, you know, people probably hear there are cars on the street in the background. We're sitting outside of that cafe in Bay Ridge. This is your home neighborhood. So yeah, I mean, what were you trying to convey in like the way you depicted these neighborhoods, and especially, you know, the fact that you did focus on Bay Ridge, which you know so well?
You know, there are a lot of great New York novels and films. Not many of them deal with the Outer Boroughs. I would say on the film side, you know, Saturday Night Fever, you know, in some ways the definitive Outer Borough movie. Great film. Honora is very good, honestly. Yeah. Honora at the Sheepshead Bay, Brighton Beach, Mill Basin side of things. I lived in Sheepshead Bay for a few years, so I was very gratified to see Honora kind of join the Southern Brooklyn canon. Yeah. And literature, most novels tend to be Manhattan-centric. Yeah. One I think of that's not is Last Exit to Brooklyn, which is a great Outer Borough novel set in Sunset Park and Red Hook. A very brutal book about working-class Brooklyn in the 1960s. A great, grim, nasty book, one I recommend. So I wanted to have a novel that spoke not just to Manhattan. That was important to me as someone who, I go to Manhattan all the time and enjoy Manhattan and not hostile to Manhattan. But I wanted to be in the Outer Boroughs too, in Queens and in Brooklyn in particular, so I grew up in Brooklyn. And though the novel doesn't deal with it directly, I would say, there is a psychic gulf between the Outer Boroughs and the city. And the city, of course, being Manhattan. And if you grew up in Brooklyn, you refer to Manhattan as the city. I'm going to the city. Yeah. You don't say I'm going to Manhattan. No, what are you doing this weekend in the city? What are you going to do, you know, in the city? And I think over time that it's flattened a little bit because of gentrification and how, you know, Brooklyn and Queens have become very attractive for real estate speculation in a way they were not in the 20th century. You know, living in Brooklyn really marked you as a socially stagnant individual. I mean, there are parts like Brooklyn Heights that are always hoity-toity, but for the most part, you were trying to get out of Brooklyn. If you were a literary or ambitious person, you had to get to Manhattan. Of course, that's the story of Donald Trump, and Donald Trump's a character in the book. Briefly, in the 1970s, Trump wants to escape Queens for Manhattan. That was the arc of the era. Saturday Night Fever, how does it end? John Travolta on a train to the city. He's getting out of Bay Ridge. He's going with his girlfriend into Manhattan, starting a new life, right? And that's still, some of that lingers. I mean, there's definitely an elitism of Manhattan versus the boroughs, but it's lost. I mean, I think because the outer boroughs have become much more gentrified, and also just a place where younger people are willing to live and pay top dollar for. You don't have that same divide. Whereas, you know, if you go back to the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, even the 90s, it's you are a person on the make. You got to Manhattan, and their whole story arcs, you know, in Sex and the City built around this. Moving to Brooklyn as some kind of apostasy, you know, which is less true now. I see a little bit of it. Funnily enough, I'd say I encounter in some ways more elitism towards the outer boroughs from transplants. I find if you're not from New York City at all, or not, you know, from the tri-state area, you're coming from another state far away, you know, to you, New York is Manhattan, so you can't imagine not living in Manhattan. It's kind of, I feel this way if I go to other cities and I think, well, would I live here? You know, I like visiting London, and I'd say, well, I want to live in Bloomsbury. I want to live in central London. I wouldn't want to live out, you know, in some outer ring, the Bay Ridge equivalent of London. I wouldn't want to, but that's because I'm an outsider. Whereas as an insider in New York, I'm kind of happy to reside in the outer boroughs. And I did live in Manhattan for a little bit. I did a stint on the Upper East Side. It wasn't bad at all, but I felt I was just temperamentally suited to Brooklyn and to having my car and to having my waterfront and my trees and sort of my quasi-suburban lifestyle while still being able to escape to the city. And in the book, I want to capture that too. That's the world I know, so I want to write about it.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, like, for me, like, I grew up in Jersey in suburbs. I lived on the Upper West Side when I was in undergrad, and now I feel like the boroughs or like neighborhoods like Bay Ridge are the best of both worlds because it's not like as busy as Manhattan, but it's also not a suburb. Like I can walk down the street and have access to, I can go to get all kinds of food. I can go to the doctor. I can go food shopping, whatever it is, which like in the suburbs you have to drive.
Exactly.
Yeah, and there aren't people on the street. And so this brings me to my question about your critique of Jane Jacobs, because this is how I first discovered you when you wrote in Compact about Robert Moses, and like you threw in the critique of Jacobs, saying that she had this kind of libertarian bent, which at first shocked me because like I think of her in these very quote-unquote crunchy terms. Like I think of her as one of these people who wants to preserve like old school neighborhoods where people look out for each other. There's a sense of community, and like I said, like you could just walk down the street and there are people and there are things to do, and it's not like, again, I'm reading it as someone who grew up in the suburbs who sees that type of that like urban neighborhood as idyllic in a certain way. And I understood what you were saying about Moses and like, the public housing and whatnot, but I don't know, say more about your critique and like, I don't know.
Well, Jacobs gets plenty right, I'll say. I mean, I believe in the walkable city. I like the neighborhoods, We sit here in Bay Ridge, I'm just watching people walk on the street and buses come by. And it's why I couldn't really stomach the suburbs, because you just can't do that. I mean, the idea that you have to wake up and I have a car and I don't mind driving, but the idea that you have to drive everywhere, that you can't just stroll out and go run some errands, I mean, that to me is insanity. So, I mean, the walkable city means a lot to me. And I think Jacobs was right to fret the trends of that era, which were could be very faceless. Could be sort of this top-down erasure of traditions. You saw the destruction of Penn Station, which was a real tragedy. I think the limits to Jacobs' vision are really when it comes to government action and affordable housing. It was Moses the villain who's building tens of thousands of units, if not hundreds of thousands probably, for working class people in New York City. And that's public housing. And public housing still is vilified then, it gets vilified now. But the reality is today the New York City Housing Authority, which expanded under Robert Moses, is housing hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who otherwise could not live here. And our homeless problem would be far worse if we didn't have this public housing. I mean, we don't have tent cities. We really don't have the homeless crisis of a West Coast city. You see some really awful examples of homelessness in other cities, and New York has real problems, but it's better because there is this system of very cheap housing for poor and working class people, and they can live there. So I believe in attractive housing. I wish, I don't love the monoliths and the block housing, and they're not pretty. And I think mixed income housing is probably the best thing you can do. But I can't vilify Robert Moses for building massive housing blocks in the Lower East Side. Or, I remember after Hurricane Sandy, there's a lot of flooding in the Rockaways, and there are all these articles about, Moses put public housing in the Rockaways. How could he? It's like, well, no, there was land there. Well, why wouldn't you build massive blocks of affordable housing on the Rockaways? I mean, that's where else would it go, right? And he did build it in Manhattan too. It wasn't like it was just heading out to the furthest reaches of Queens. I mean, there's public housing built everywhere. So I think that the Jacobs vision is important. It's important to have a balance, but the Jacobs vision doesn't say much about government action to build public infrastructure projects. You need big projects, right? What does Jacobs say about Lincoln Center? What does Jacobs say about the United Nations? not all the highway projects were evil. Some of them were necessary. You could go on and on. I mean, Moses really comes out of the New Deal tradition. It's the big government tradition. Jacobs is more libertarian in that sense. He's not looking for muscular government action in a way to impose its will on people, which was bad, right? But a lot got done. And that's the thing, even in the power broker that Caro has to concede, we stopped building. California can't build high-speed rail to save its life. If you had kind of a Moses era framework, that project would have been done years ago. I mean, Moses was throwing up bridges in a handful of years and tunnels and housing and the parks. I mean, the park, I don't know what Jacobs has to say about Flushing Meadows Park. I mean, it's a marvel. It was an ash heap. It was an absolute dump, and Moses turned it into a magnificent world-class park that is used by working-class people today. So I think there's a balance, right? I mean, too much Moses is a problem. Unaccountable bureaucracy is lousy. You need democracy. But look, in some ways, in terms of building, I don't want to say there's too much democracy. There's too many choke points. Everyone has a say. Not every community group has a say, and there are many excuses to stop good development, and that's an issue. I have a problem with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something to be said about maintaining this tension between realism and idealism. Because if we lose that kind of vision that Jacobs had of the neighborhood,
right?
Then we're screwed. But if we don't consider the reality of there's certain needs that need to be accounted for, then nothing gets done. But I don't know. I mean, the other thing that, again, going back to this issue of how the outer boroughs, the sections that are gentrifying versus the ones like Bay Ridge that kind of maintain a certain distinctive Brooklyn flavor. I guess part of what draws me to Jacobs' vision is that I understand on one hand there's the issue of affordable housing for working class, lower income people, but in neighborhoods like this, which are mixed, you have people who are fairly well to do, middle class, etc. My fear is when people lose that sense of ownership over their neighborhood, pride, being involved, participation in local life, whether it's in businesses, churches, civic associations, then that opens the door to developers to build these these kind of gentrified developments that you lose everything. You lose the sense of the people's again, their sense that this is their neighborhood and that they have roots here and that it matters, and the consequences of that, what we see in northern parts of Brooklyn, to me, that's disturbing. Something is flawed.
Well, I agree with you, and I would say, I mean, Robert Moses' vision for housing is not what happened in North Brooklyn. It's not market rate housing. The idea, if you told Robert Moses that today the way housing gets built is you let a private developer make it 70-80% market rate and throw in some affordable housing, and the government has no serious role in it, you'd think that was laughable. I mean, he was getting billions in federal dollars to build these public and subsidized housing projects. So it was the government. The model went from the government building fixed income housing to the private sector building market rate housing that is subject to the whims of the market. So instead of getting, let's say, prettier public housing in the Williamsburg waterfront that's fixed income or real mixed income housing, maybe it's a 50-50 split, you get apartments renting for $8,000 a month. And I mean, at that point, it's a financier class that is not going to have the same ties to a civic life, whereas you could have some of that if you had real mixed income housing. You had the Vienna model where you very, very cheap, well-run housing. Public housing doesn't have to be poorly maintained. And for many years, NYCHA was well-maintained, and it fell into disrepair. But I wish that was the model we saw pursued, which was the federal government and the state government and local governments were overseeing the construction of housing and subsidizing it. That's not the case anymore. The federal government retreated from it entirely. Now it's all up to the private sector, and that's the whole YIMBY thing and the whole abundance thing. And I'm not against the YIMBYs, but if we're up to the YIMBYs, that there would never be any public housing in New York City, and that would be awful in my view.
So no, now I wanted to shift to this. I'll wait for it to pass. Okay. No, so I mean, leading up to the release of the novel, like you've written a couple Substack posts about this desire to write "quote unquote" great novel, which I mean, it's striking because it made me think of what was it, Timothy Chalamet at the I don't know if it was the Oscars or some award show, but he was like, I know this isn't cool to say anymore, but like I want to be a great artist. I want to aspire to greatness. And it's like, it's true. Like people don't talk that way anymore. Like either you want to talk about making socially responsible art, like you want to, have a good representation and blah, 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 blah. Or you write this kind of ironic autofiction that's like, yeah, none of this matters, ha ha ha. But you're saying, no, like I want to write something great, even if it doesn't turn out that great, at least I want to make the effort. Yeah, I mean, I don't hear anybody talking that way. So like, why? Why do you want to write a great novel, and then why do you say it also?
I'm definitely, I love, irony as a literary tool is wonderful. Irony as a lifestyle is not. I'm sick of the sort of millennial and I guess Z now ironic pose. I don't like autofiction. Ironically, I'm not against the concept itself that Henry Miller is one of my favorite writers and he's an autofictional writer. But the problem with autofiction as it's practiced today is it's this very insular in dull, insipid style, and the writing is very pared down, and it's just, writers meandering about their upper middle class lives, and I just don't care. I'm not interested in it. And most of these books, with a few exceptions, aren't that well written. I believe in great art. I take my work seriously. My father said that one should take their work seriously, but not themselves, and it always stuck with me in that. His views have a sense of humor. Don't be too self-important, but take your work seriously. Yeah. Take the work seriously, and that's how he lived his life. That's how I live mine. My writing is serious. My books are serious. They're not serious in the sense that they can't be funny, but they're intense projects that come from who I am. Everything I publish, is a record of me, and I want it to be of high quality. I believe in it. It's in that way, it's almost spiritual. And I don't understand the writer who doesn't believe in their own work and doesn't believe in themselves. And to me, a lot of the irony seems like a defense mechanism. If you go LOL, LMAO, this isn't serious, then when someone criticizes your work, you can retreat from it. You can hide. Whereas if you're earnest and say, I want to make a great work of art, you open yourself up to criticism. People can come to you and say, well, this isn't great at all. I think I made a great work of art with Glass Century, and so far the critics seem to agree, which is nice. But even if they didn't, I would still think that way. I spent a lot of time on it. I thought about it a great deal. I was painstaking with it. It's a part of who I am, and that's how I think artists should be. I mean, I think especially now, you have to defend the novel. You have to defend the artistic practice, in this age of like AI slop and honestly Philistines everywhere. The professional upper middle class is just filled with Philistines now, unfortunately, where it used to be one to have, real bona fides in certain communities had to be acquainted with art. Now that's less true. You just talk about, certain HBO shows or something, and nothing against HBO shows. I like HBO shows, but that's not the be all end all of life itself. And I care a lot about art. I'm going to keep caring, and I hope honestly my pose is inspiring for other people. I'm hoping other young writers see that yes, you can take yourself serious or take your art seriously. You can believe in it. You can believe you did something good or even great, and let the chips fall. The other pose I hate in the literary world, besides the ironic pose, the faux humble pose, because none of them are actually humble. It's the humble brag. I don't do humble brags. I'll brag or I won't, right? Yeah. But I'm so I'm so fortunate. Thank you, so blessed to be, but it's all very fake. I don't like it. And it's become the default mode of talking in the literary world. And my goal, I would love to be at the top of the literary world, but I'm also not going to adopt their strange mores. Like I think it's tired. I think they've become too irrelevant to too many people. It doesn't have to be that way. You look on Substack, a lot of people care about art and literature still, and the literary world can't be divorced from that. And I want people to care about art and care about what I do, and that starts with taking the work seriously and being earnest about it. I really do think that.
No, and I strongly recommend that people check out the book, because in addition to being, I think, a really great novel, I think it covers themes that... It covers so many themes in a way that it has... I don't know, there's like a real attention to the details, to the nuances of relationships, of certain social dynamics, political dynamics. And also, so let's plug, so you have your Substack, Political Currents,
yes,
right?
Political Currents, my Substack. Please subscribe. Just search my name, Ross Barkan, you'll find it. And buy Glass Century. It's available in all online retailers. Getting into more bookstores. You go to P&T Knitwear in Manhattan. They've got a lot of copies. But you can always get it there, get it online, any online retailer. Got the ebook, and we've got audiobook. So you can do the audiobook. We've got a nice voice actor doing it. So if you're into that, get it. And if you want to review it on Goodreads, it's a ghost request, but that's what people do. You can go review it too if you feel that way. But definitely just read the book and enjoy it.
Awesome. Well, Ross, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me. This is great.